All right. Today we are interviewing Dr. Andrew Jordan on his book regarding Jesus and the Talmud. And we're going to be discussing Jesus the Nazarene, how he's regarded in the Talmud, the studies and development and interpretation of the Yeshu narrative within Rabbinic tradition. And today I'm focused really on what the Talmud has to say and how that speaks to the Jewish understanding of Jesus or Yeshu. So I see that you come from a conservative Jewish background as well, from the intro of your book, which is cool. I'd like to start by asking what's your background in the studies of Jesus and the Talmud, what got you interested, and where all you went with that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's great to be with you today. I enjoyed listening to your other episodes, so it's good to talk to you. I would say probably my interest in the narrative of Jesus in the Talmud started through do a daily study of Talmud called Daf Yomi, which means a page a day. For those who aren't familiar, the Talmud is a large corpus of material, around 2 million words. And there's a program of study where you study 1 page a day to work your way through the text. And so I started doing that probably I guess it's a 7-year cycle. So I started on the last cycle, whenever that started. And as you read through, you find it, and the most popular text of the Talmud today is the Koren Steinalt's version of the Talmud, which is the closest thing we have in Judaism to an eclectic text in a similar way that Christians have the eclectic New Testament text. It's quite different, but it's the closest thing. And as you know, religious Jews tend to work from the original language text, so it's not translation is not much of an issue. But anyway, the Koren Talmud is mostly the Vilna text, which is the standard Talmudic text, but it has restored censored material from, I assume they take it from Munich manuscripts, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So anyway, those passages appear as you study through the Talmud, and that's what got me interested in what can the Talmud teach us about Jesus? What does it mean for rabbinic interpretation, polemics, etc.?
All right. Quite reasonable. So I'm gonna have a preface to my question here, but it's basically, who is the historical Jesus? I think Geza Vermesh views Jesus as a charismatic leader, healer, which I think is kind of charitable, to say the least. I'm not sure about all the miracles that it talks about. I think some of the miracles in eschatology was added into the gospel narrative after the destruction of the temple and as they were developing their Christology. But we'll get into that maybe a little later with some of the questions about what's talked about in the Talmud. But in the Talmud, what can we learn about the historical Jesus? Looking at Jesus within Judaism can be challenging. One, of course, we have to acknowledge the church history of anti-Semitism and the issues that Judaism has had to wrestle with in context to that. The history of Jewish Christian dialogue and things like that. Currently, things are much better than they've been at different times in history. The Talmud does offer some beneficial insights to Jewish thinking regarding Jesus, the Nazarenes, and the minim, and we'll get into that as we go through this today. I'd like to take you through a series of questions on this and see what we can glean about the historical Jesus within the Talmud. So to start it off, Bart Ehrman says the Talmud is written late. It's very of little benefit to understand the historical Jesus because he feels more like it's a late writing and it's kind of polemical. So in the same light, though, the New Testament is historically inaccurate, not the best place to learn about the historical Jesus. So he doesn't have a fair assessment of either text to ascertain who the historical Jesus is. So kind of as a preface, what do you think? What benefit do we get from the Talmud to understand the historical Jesus and the way Jews have looked at Jesus throughout history?
Yeah, sure. So I think the best place to start is probably thinking about the historical Jesus for a second, in that obviously there's no consensus about who the historical Jesus is. That's a matter of intense debate. And I think the main reason why that's an issue is the nature of the sources that we have. The sources that we have are there for a reason. We have the sources that were carefully curated for us from history, and the alternative sources that we have only been found by accident. So we have the Gospels and the Pauline corpus and etc., because that was the canon that was decided by Catholic Christianity. And we found the Nag Hammadi text and Oxyrhynchus fragments and other things like that by chance. So those are just things that we either have from what we're meant to see from what the winners of the Christian internal debates about of orthodoxy decided was the view of who Jesus was, and then everything else we've discovered by chance of what survived in the elements and things like that. So when we're talking about the historical Jesus, it's always a question of sources and how do we evaluate the sources that we have, and how to evaluate the Gospels and their historicity. It's true that the Talmud doesn't tell us a lot about the historical Jesus, but I would also say that the Gospels don't either. It's really all of the texts are about how to interpret how to interpret who Jesus is to the community that is being addressed. For me personally, I started whenever you get interested in this, you but think about the historical Jesus a lot, because it's sort of that eternal question: who was this person who started the Christian, who led to the Christian religion, I guess we could say. But the more and more that time goes on, I don't think it really matters who he was, because there's no religion today that follows the historical Jesus. And I would even argue that people who are groups that were maybe closer, even the Ebionites and groups like that, still didn't follow the historical Jesus exactly as he existed. So that's a kind of a series of caveats to just get to the issue of what the Talmud can say. And I think so it's important when talking about the Talmud to realize that when it was redacted. So I'll do a sort of a brief spiel about the Talmud itself. So the Talmud is obviously, like I was just saying, a corpus. So it's much more akin to maybe Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews for Christian listeners than it is to, say, the New Testament, for example. The Babylonian Talmud has about 2 million words. And so it's a very large corpus of material. It's a library, not one book. And so people don't read the Talmud. As I was saying earlier, there is programs of study, but it's not something you read. You study it, learn it, and that kind of thing. So, but the Talmud is not just it didn't just come out of nowhere 500 years out after the time of Jesus. It's a collection of earlier materials too. So the earliest layers of rabbinic literature come from around 200 CE, which would be the Mishnah and the Tosefta, which are the Mishnah was the first codification, not codification, the first presentation of the oral law, which is a core concept in rabbinic Judaism, that there was a written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and a oral Torah, which is the explanation of how to perform those commandments that are given in the Torah. And so I could just give an example just for the people who aren't familiar. There's the command to let's see, what's a good example. Thinking of the Shema, for example, this is a text of declaration of faith in God, more or less, that is said by Jewish people in the morning and the evening. And how do we know that you're supposed to do this in the morning and the evening? Because the text says when you lie down and when you get up. So what does that mean? That means in the morning and the evening, and that is the oral Torah, basically understanding how to perform the commandments that are in the Torah. Or another example for Christian audiences is always fun to ask is, what is the first commandment in the Bible? and a lot of times Christians don't know, but it's the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. And so you would have to know then, how do you know when you have been fruitful and multiplied? And the answer is when you have two children. And there's debate obviously in modern times and et cetera, but so that's the gist of it. So that's the oral Torah, and that was first written down in the Mishnah around 200 CE. The Tosefta is an additional collection of material that is supplemental to the Mishnah. There's different understandings as to the relationship between those two texts, which came first and how they relate to each other, but more or less they were codified around 200 CE. And so that's the earliest you could place official rabbinic literature. I would say that you could even date Jewish counter narrative to Jesus earlier than that, in the form of the preservation of the narrative of Celsus in the text of Origen, who was a third century Christian author, but he preserved the second century anti-Christian polemical text from the pagan author Celsus, who preserves some Jewish argumentation, which you can also see in Justin Martyr as well. Not the words of Celsus, but the general take of Jewish approach to Jesus, which you can see developed in the rabbinic literature. So you have, it is true that it is late, and there are certain elements of the story that do develop later, but the core of the material comes from the earlier period. So it's not as late as Bart Ehrman is probably hinting at there, but it is later. But I think, and also, and this is kind of more speculative, but you can pick up on elements of the of rabbinic, well, not rabbinic, of Jewish response to Christianity in the New Testament itself if you read carefully. That's a bit more speculative in the sense that we don't know what the other people were saying, so you have to kind of read into it a little bit. But so that is a roundabout way of saying that it's true that the Talmud doesn't necessarily say much about the historical Jesus, but again, to reiterate, neither does the New Testament, because what's more important is who is Jesus for those communities and what do they think about him?
Yeah. And yeah, that's kind of what I want to get into today. So let's get into what is in the Talmud. Let's start with the references to Yeshu in the Talmud. Who is he? Is Yeshu a derogatory name or a common shortening of Yehoshua? And what does the Talmud, what is it called? What is the Talmud called Jesus? Are they all the same person? Or are they a different person? Do they speak to, in the historical Jesus narrative, one of the theories is there's an amalgamation of various messianic pretenders, would be what I would say, or messianic people who thought they were going to be Messiah and were cut off in the first century, and that the stories of the New Testament is maybe based on one character, but it's also an amalgamation of various other characters. So within the Talmud, where when they talk about the various references, is it one person or is it a few different people? And I know that it changes over history, like whether it's multiple people or they see it as one, or depending who you're talking to. But how do you see that?
Sure. This is a good place to start, because this is probably one of the first things that people will say about the Talmud, that there was not one person that's being referred to, but different people. And this is also going to be the case with the chronology, which I think is something you wanted to talk about a little later too. And this goes back to how Jesus is referred to in the Talmud. I'll first just reference what one of the first questions there was. The name is spelt in Hebrew and Aramaic, Yeshu. And so this is reflective of the Syriac pronunciation of the name Yeshua, which has the Hebrew letter Ayin, which is like kind of a guttural sound from Sephardic and older reconstructions of older Hebrew, which was lost in Galilean pronunciation of Aramaic, and this is something that's mentioned in the Talmud, and something that the rabbis who were centered in Jerusalem kind of made fun of the Galileans for not pronouncing the ayin correctly. So that it reflects that loss of that sound, which I don't do that great, but you might have heard of it. If you know Arabic or have heard Arabic, it's still pronounced in Arabic, and you can hear that. So it's not a derogatory name. It does show up later in Ashkenazi sources from Europe, as sort of an acronym in Hebrew to mean something like "May his name be forgotten."
Yeah.
But I don't see any evidence of that in the Talmud itself. And so the name Yeshua is obviously a shortened form of Yehoshua, meaning Joshua in English, and was a fairly common name. So it's the name, and that name itself doesn't have any derogatory things to it. And so the other names that Jesus is known as is Ben Stada and Ben Pantera or Ben Pandera, or Ben Pantiri. Those are just kind of different vocalizations of the Aramaic. As your listeners might or might not know, that Hebrew and Aramaic don't write vowels, at least traditionally. In later periods, there was the system of Nikud, which puts little markings above and below the letters to help you know how to pronounce it. But in the earlier period, that was not practiced. So there's different ways of understanding how to which vowels to put in those places. So the names Ben Stada and Ben Pantera are often used to say that this is not referring to Jesus, the historical Christian character that we're talking about here. And this is done by both scholars, although a minority. Most scholars today understand that the references in the Talmud are to the historical, not the historical Jesus, to the Christian figure Jesus, I'll say, to the Jesus of faith, maybe we could say. And the historical Jesus, I think you can glean some things from the references, but it's not direct. So the names of Ben Stada and Ben Pantera are, that's kind of a way that is understood. And that argument actually goes back to medieval rabbis themselves in the famous European disputations between Christians and Jews. The argument was quickly developed that these were not referring to the Christian Jesus for a very practical reason of avoiding being subject to church authorities and things like that. So it had a very practical purpose in that historical context. However, both of those references are to the Jesus character, although you could make an argument that Ben Stada is not necessarily referring to it. But so the Ben Stada and Ben Pantera narratives come from the earlier layers of the tradition. They appear in the Tosefta and the Jerusalem Talmud. And so they're from the earlier period of the development of this narrative. And so the Ben Stada, Ben Pantera is more obviously referencing Jesus, because in the association of Jesus with Pantera goes back to Celsus, the Roman source that we were mentioning earlier, who says that Mary was impregnated by a Roman soldier by the name of Pantera. And so Jesus in the Tosefta is called Jesus ben Pantera, and it is a somewhat non-polemical use of the term, because it is just stated that that there were people who healed in the name of Jesus ben Pantera, and there's a few stories related to that. So it's less polemical. The material that is polemical from the earlier era is associated with the name Ben Stada, and this is where we're going to see the association with magic and being executed on the Passover. That's where that part of the tradition is first referred to. And I would agree here with Peter Schaeffer, who has written one of the more famous books on this topic, that the earlier material is more carefully coded in Greco-Roman Palestine due to the context of Christian hegemony in the Byzantine period. So I would say that the Ben Stada tradition is a careful code word for Jesus to avoid any issues with Christian authorities in the Byzantine Empire. But I think that it's quite obvious if you read the text that it's referring to the Christian figure Jesus.
Okay. There's also references to Yeshu HaNatsari. I believe the title Jesus the Nazarene, and then the later association of Christianity with Nazarenes. And this kind of gets into an argument I have between the differences between the Nazarene and the Ebionites. But it's not really a point of the Talmud, and we may cover some of that a little later. What do you make of, I guess, the references to Yeshua HaNatsari and the Christians being called Nazarenes within the Talmud?
Yeah, so I kind of failed to mention, but in the Tosefta there is, I believe, I'm going to quote off memory. So I believe that when Jesus is referred to as Jesus HaNotzri, that is in reference to his teaching. There's a famous episode where Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, who is a famous Second Temple first century rabbi, is tried for heresy. And he mentions a teaching in the name of Jesus the Nazarene. I believe that is correct. I can check just to make sure. But yeah, that is the other name that Jesus is known by. Jesus, I just prefer to say Hanotzri, because when we say Nazarene, we're implying some things that I'm not 100% sure that the Talmud means that. So in the transition from, so maybe we should have mentioned this earlier, but so Christian history obviously begins with Jesus, even though he probably didn't have anything to do with the religion itself. But anyway, his life set off what became Christianity. And so the Christian story really develops after the destruction of the temple, and it just ascends from there, goes up, right? And that's when kind of Christians don't know what happens to Jews after that moment. But as we both know, the period from the destruction of the temple in 70 to the Bar Kokhba revolt was a very low point for the Jewish people, with a lot of suffering and death and things like that. And being forbidden from being in Jerusalem, renaming it into the Roman name that took away the reference to Jerusalem. And it's so at that point, that was kind of the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism, which I've often described as a survival mechanism for after losing the temple. And it's stuck around for a while, so it worked. Whereas Sadduceeism and Essenism didn't work because they didn't have that component. So, but anyway, the Jewish life reorganized in Galilee for a few centuries. And there was an earlier version of the Talmud that was developed there called the Jerusalem Talmud. Even it wasn't developed in Jerusalem, but for some reason it's called that. But anyway, later in history, 400, 500-ish, the center of gravity in the Jewish world shifted to Babylon, to Iraq and Iran, where Jews had been living since the first Babylonian exile. And so in the transition from Greco-Roman Palestine to Sasanian, or sometimes called Sassanid Iraq or Iran, you had a change of culture, and things were very different from that moment. And in the earlier period, we were saying that there was a reluctance to engage with Christianity, and scholars have now kind of understood that in the Babylonian period, there was much more willingness from the Jewish the rabbinic leadership to engage polemically with Christianity, because there was no threat of Christian leadership. The leadership in Iran was Zoroastrian in the 500s to the time of Islam. So there was no confrontation there, and in the same way that the Byzantines were a Christian empire. So the Talmud in Babylon is much more willing to engage polemically with Christianity. It's also common now for scholars to understand that the rabbis had a very intimate knowledge of Christianity and Christian sources through Syriac Christianity, which was Aramaic-speaking Christianity in the East, that in the Syriac Christians served as sort of intermediary between the Greek and Latin culture of the West and the Aramaic speaking and later Arabic speaking East. So they would translate texts into Aramaic, and that would make it accessible to other Semitic languages. And the Syriac dialect of Aramaic is very similar to Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which is what the Talmud is written in mostly. And there's also Mandaeans who speak Aramaic as well. So the Aramaic language was sort of the vehicle through which this knowledge was shared. Sorry, I kind of lost track of the question. Can you repeat some of the question? I kind of started.
Well, so my question was about Yeshua HaNazari and how
okay, yeah.
Nazari term or the Christians became called Nazarenes. I personally feel that has a lot to do with the Pauline influence of Christianity. But the term HaNazari for Yeshu and then Nazarene for Christianity.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. That's why I was going. Sorry. So the term Nazari, I leave it just in Hebrew as it is because in Babylonia the term for Christians is in Aramaic is Nats. Hold on, I've got to just think. I think it's Nazraye in Aramaic. It doesn't appear in the Talmud. This is from Syriac literature, and the Zoroastrians also refer to Christians that way. So there's some debate about what Nazari means as it relates to Jesus, and also the Nazarim, which is we could say the Nazarenes, maybe in quotes. It's typically understood with the Nazarim to refer to Christianity, Christians, although it only occurs 2 times in the Talmud. It's a very infrequent term, the specific Nazarim, and it has to do with certain legal regulations that revolve around Sunday. So in one case, there's a ruling of what business negotiations you're allowed to have with the Nazarim on Sunday, because that's their day. And the other one is that you're not allowed to fast on Sunday because it's the day of the Nazarim. Those are the 2 references to Nazarim. And it's usually understood to be Christianity, but it is also important to note that the Mandaeans call themselves Nasuraya, also Nasuraya, which is like the Mandaic form of Nasraye, the Syriac form. So you can hear the sound Nasuraya, Nasraye, Notsri. Semitic languages are built around roots of the same sounds, so the consonants, and so it's just a slight variation. So the Mandaeans are also called Nazarenes technically, and they also
come from the Nazaritic vow, or I mean, where does their version of the name derive from?
From what I understand, I'm not a specialist on Mandaeans, but from what I understand, that for them the Nazarenes are the like the initiated ones, the like kind of elite Mandaeans who kind of have the secret knowledge, because they're a Gnostic, the only surviving Gnostic sect. So the Nazarenes in their religion are the priests, or kind of the religious authorities. I'm not sure where it derives from, and that's probably a matter of big debate among Mandaean scholars. There's a lot of issues with Mandaean literature and how to date it, and where the provenance of Mandaeans, are they originally from Palestine or somewhere else? So there's a lot of debate about that, and a lot of their literature was actually destroyed, from what I understand. So there's also some questions about, was it faithfully reconstructed and things like that. So it's not unambiguous. It could refer to Mandaeans, Notzrim, in the Talmud, but I think it's pretty safe to say it's probably Christians. I don't know, that's something I'm trying to figure out, is the demographics of what was the breakdown of Christians versus Jews and Mandaeans in Sasanian Iran, but I haven't been able to find that information. So if Christians were more numerous, which I assume they were, then it probably is Christians. But I always like to kind of throw that caveat there, just to make sure that Mandaeans are not forgotten in the debate. And then when we're referring to Jesus, it's even more complicated. what does Nazarene mean in the Talmud? Does it mean, is it a sectarian identification of Jesus? Like, is it projecting back to the earlier period? Is this some remnant of historical record? I think that's possible. I think there's definitely a connection between Mandaeans being called Nazarenes and the early Christians being called Nazarenes. There's something going on there. And there's also a reference in Epiphanius to a sect called the Nazarenes, which is very related, but they have some beliefs that are similar to the Mandaeans, according to Epiphanius. He's the only person who mentions it, unfortunately. So it's kind of hard to do much more with that than speculate. But it seems like there's a connection. I don't know what that ultimately would be, but it does seem to be something there. There's also some scholars who say that in the Talmud that Jesus is being portrayed as like a stereotypical Christian. So it's they would almost say it's reading like Jesus the Christian, and in using that character to like project polemics against Christianity. I think I lean more that there's some sort of historical memory there, than rather than saying Jesus the Christian. But that's just me.
I think if you look at Christian sources and the term Nazarene and Ebionites as different movements, I think it might be something in that direction. But so kind of moving along.
I can say quickly, just Ebionites and Nazarenes. Yeah, there's a lot of like, we don't know exactly what they called themselves, and if they use the name Nazarene and Ebionites. Obviously, the records that we have are from polemical Christian heresiology. So it's always like take it at a grain of salt what they say. And it seems probably more likely they call themselves Nazarenes than Ebionites, but that's sort of a debate. I think that's a matter of debate in scholarship on that.
Well, there are two different camps in what their beliefs are, and in the Christian and anti-Jewish polemics, or whatever the polemics where they were debating those things, it seems like they made a differentiation between the two, especially in their beliefs, and but they seem to be in relation to each other, but not within the Talmud. There's a whole argument to be made on that.
You want
kind of moving along. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about minim now?
I kind of was going to come to that a little bit later.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem. I just
within my notes here. Yeah, I was going to come back to that a little bit later. So I was still kind of trying to lay the foundation of kind of second, third, fourth century, the what's building the foundation of, I guess, the text of the historical Jesus in the Talmud and in relation to Christianity. You know, what do you make of like the statements in Philo and Josephus that kind of you know, because they're considered Jewish sources, you know, what do you make of those? And then, you know, you have Tacitus, Pliny, and you mentioned Celsus, and there's even the polemical dialogue with Trypho the Jew. So before we really get more back into the Talmud, what do you make of kind of that Christian polemical dialogue and where you find some of those other references?
I think especially with the dialogue with Trypho, which is similar to Celsus in the sense that it's a non-Jewish person impersonating a Jewish response to Christianity. And I've read a few different kinds of approaches to what that might mean. Some people think that there might be some sort of source to it, like an actual source, especially with Celsus, like some sort of tract maybe or something like that. It could also just be this is what Jewish people were saying. I think that they would locate some of this to Alexandria or different population centers of that time where there would be a large Jewish population. So it wouldn't be something that you would you know, just trying to imagine what it would have been like at that time if you were a sort of in a cosmopolitan setting, you might have heard Jewish reactions to Christianity. So it could be either a source or it could be just kind of based off oral material, in the sense of the word of this sometimes uses collective memory, which is kind of like what people say or how they what the group of people understands about a topic. You can think of American people who how we think about maybe the Pilgrims and the George Washington. There's kind of like a national myth that develops that's loosely based off history, but kind of in and out of historical validity. And this is that happens with Christians and Jews, obviously, with response to Jesus. So Jews started talking about this and would interact with Christians. So either way, I think that both of those texts reflect Jewish attitudes at the time. And I think if you read them carefully, you can see the sort of kernel of what the rabbinic material developed into, because you see references to Jesus as a sorcerer. You see the Pantera tradition, and you might see one other thing, but I don't remember. There might be one other aspect to it that's there. The other material, I think Pliny and Tacitus mostly mention Christians rather than Jesus himself. But I think they're important to establish that there probably was a guy earlier in the first century who was, that there was a group that was founded after him, but not much else. But it might tell us a little bit about what Christians were doing at that time, what they were believing. Josephus, obviously, there's the contentious Testimonium Flavianum. I don't really want to get into that, but if you look at the other reference, I think the reference to James, the brother of Jesus, or Jacob is actually his real name, but it's only translated James because King James of England wanted to be in the Bible. So so I always try to say Jacob just because that's what his name is. But so I think that other reference is more. I think it's hard to. There are some people who say it's interpolated, but I think that's kind of a stretch. So, and I'm not aware of Philo making any reference to Jesus or Christianity, but if that exists, I haven't seen it, so I don't have an opinion on that. But I think all of those just broadly serve to say that there was a historical Jesus. I don't buy into mythicism, and that there was a Christian movement, and that the Romans were aware of it at a certain point. So, they had their own reasons to react to it, which were due to the civic religious cult. And the Jews obviously had exemption from that. But as Christianity began to become something other than Judaism, that became a big problem from the Roman point of view, because they were essentially Christians were breaking the law, not worshiping the gods. And that was a problem because they considered that to be essential for like the success of their city and things like that. So that if they didn't sacrifice to the gods, they might lose wars, or the weather might not work for the crops and things like that. So it was a problem for the Romans for different reasons. But I think from the Christian point of view, in the Celsus material, in that you see the kernel of rabbinic material.
All right. So that kind of lays the foundation. Now getting into the Talmud, what does the Talmud tell us, and what can we ascertain potentially about the chronology of Jesus' life? And what do you make of like the context of the Roman conquest of Judea, and the setup for, I guess, the historical Jesus, and where the narrative in the Talmud comes in, like what time period that comes in?
Yeah, this is probably the other thing that people most know about the Talmud is the if you just post online, you're like, oh, it can't be about Jesus because it's 100 years before when the Gospels say that Jesus was born. So there's the reference to the chronology is sometimes called the alternative chronology of the Talmud, because it does so. There's different kind of ways of laying it out, but it generally would place Jesus's life you could say he died maybe around 66 BCE if you were to follow the chronology like exactly as it's in the Talmud. And a lot of that comes from medieval commentators who kind of work with that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But so that is has to do with, and that's the way you see that in the Talmud is by who Jesus is associated with, which is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia, who is Jesus's teacher in the Talmud. And so in Yehoshua, according to the records in Pirkei Avot, which is a tractate that lists the rabbinic chain of transmission of the oral Torah, Yehoshua lived during the time of Alexander Jannaeus, who was a Hasmonean king in the after the Maccabees, when there was the independent Jewish kingdom in Palestine. So obviously that chronology doesn't match with what the Gospels say. I do think that the Gospels are probably correct in the sense that all the records that, like Josephus, for example, is talking in the 1st century CE. That's when we're assuming that Jesus lived. The records of, there's a lot of debate about which date is correct. A lot of scholars say 30 CE, some say 33, 34, 27, 28, 29. I think a lot of that comes down to that we do have two irreconcilable dates. We have the synoptics and we have John, who disagree. And because of the dating when they place it, is it on the eve of Passover or the day after? He says Nisan 14 or 15. And if you, depending on which one of those you pick, your dates are limited, because now we can go back with astronomical data and look and see, when did this occur on this date, and things like that. So you're left with at least two versions of when Jesus died in the Gospels themselves. So these matters were not set in stone, we could say, but I think roughly we could say that Jesus lived in the first half of the 1st century. That's I don't like to get in too much into debates. I say like 27 to 33, somewhere in there is when he died, probably. And the birth is like 6 to 4 or something like that. And then, so why does the Talmud place it earlier? That's like the big, $1,000 question. This is actually one of the later things in the Talmud. It doesn't exist earlier. It only shows up in the Babylonian Talmud. It's a later kind of, if you think of it as an onion, like I would say the oldest material is the Pantera traditions and the idea that Jesus is a sorcerer. That's the oldest kind of kernel to the rabbinic reaction to Jesus. And then, you could go around and build layers to it. So the one of the last layers is the alternative chronology. And so we don't really know why that happened. There's a few, you could say maybe they just had a different collective memory. They had a different tradition about it, that, he was born earlier and it's just different. They just understood it differently. They were, in this case, we would be saying, the rabbis were just incorrect about that. And there's been some scholars who have noted that there's some internal inconsistencies in how dates are remembered in Josephus, for example. So he misremembers like when things happened in his own life. And there's some other examples from the period of kind of hazy chronology. So maybe it just kind of happens, it kind of gradually slipped and just, started to differ. I think that it's more likely, if you look at later material, so the Talmud is finished probably around 500 to 600 CE. Then we have the next level of Jewish history is the Gaonic period, which is the rabbis who inherited the Talmud in Babylonia. And there's a famous rabbi named Saadia Gaon who wrote extensively polemic material against Christianity. And he starts to use the alternative chronology to basically argue against Jesus as being Messiah. And it has to do with kind of a complicated calculation based off the prophecies in Daniel. But essentially he says that like the Christians did the math wrong. So it's impossible for Jesus to be the Messiah because he wasn't born, he didn't fulfill the prophecy correctly according to Daniel. And this is made more explicitly by later authors. Maimonides mentions this kind of tangentially, the Kuzari, which is Yehuda Halevi, and then most famously is Abraham ibn Daud, who was a historian and chronicler from Spain, and I think he ended up in Egypt, but I don't remember. I think that the development of the alternative chronology was a polemical device used to argue against Jesus as Messiah. However, in the Talmud itself, there is not an explicit argument in that sense. The Talmud doesn't actually mention Jesus as a Messiah at all. So
Yeah.
so I think you might ask about that, but
Mhm.
so it actually doesn't mention him as Messiah at all. So I think this might be a development of a polemics, but not really like fully fully developed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Okay, so you've mentioned Pantera a couple times. Um, who were Jesus' parents according to the Talmud? What are your thoughts on James Tabor's book, where he makes a case that Pantera existed and he was a Jewish soldier that was in Tiberias? And the early Ebionites believed that Joseph was the physical father of Jesus, that there was no miraculous birth. So what does the Talmud say about Jesus' parentage, and what do you make of that?
Yeah. So the Talmudic narrative has the mother being Miriam, but she's referred to as a with an epithet that is essentially is referred to as it's variously translated, but sometimes translated as hairdresser. But the word is Megadela, which obviously, if you know the Christian narrative, would call up Magdalene. It sounds very similar. And so there seems to be a conflation of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. And scholars have recently pointed out in the last like 10 years or so that comes from Syriac Christianity, because in the East they had the tradition that Mary Magdalene was actually the mother of Jesus. So it probably comes from that interaction with and knowledge of Syriac materials. It does mention Miriam, and the name Ben Stada, which we referenced earlier, is actually most likely a reference to Miriam herself. In the Babylonian Talmud, there's an explanation that Ben Stada is Ben Pantera. They're the same person. And Ben Stada is an Aramaic kind of pun, so to speak, which means it's setata, she strayed from her husband. So it's a reference to the idea that she was unfaithful to her husband with it doesn't say soldier in the Talmud, but with the man Pantera. And I think that the rabbis had some knowledge of the Celsus material, either through like if there was some source that existed, Jewish source, or it was just kind of common knowledge. Somehow they knew that material. So I think just using the name Ben Pantera was meant to call up that association with the soldier and all of that. And so that's this. And then so in that same passage in the Talmud, there's a reference to the husband of Mary being Papos ben Yehuda, who is sort of this kind of relatively unknown character, but it's a completely different time period. It's like 200 CE, so it doesn't really work with how it is. And some scholars have tried to say like it's some sort of play on words, or like it's doing some sort of interpretive polemics, but I'm not sure exactly what the Papos ben Yehuda material is meant to do. It's only mentioned once, so it's just sort of it's unresolved in the Talmud too. They just say, oh, I think it's Rav Hula or Ula who says that it's Papos ben Yehuda, and it just doesn't, it leaves it unresolved, so we don't know. And then so there's no mention of Joseph in the Talmud, only Miriam and Pantera. So that according to the Talmud, that would be who Jesus' parents are, and that's obviously meant as an insult, to say that he was born out of wedlock, and implied that he would be a mamzer, because if Miriam was engaged to whoever her husband was, if she had relations with another man, that would make the offspring a bastard, mamzer. So that's obviously an insult and a polemical remark. It's not. And so we mentioned earlier anti Judaism from the Christian side. There's obviously also anti-Christianity from the Jewish side, and that's an important thing to be aware of in interfaith dialogue and that kind of thing for the modern world. So So in the Talmud, those would be the parents of Jesus. There's been James Tabor is not the only one who's he's popularized some older theories, and there's some other people who are looking into the Pantera stuff as a authentic tradition. It's old, so I think there might be something to it. It definitely seems like the Gospels are hinting at some sort of irregularity, especially Matthew in the birth of Jesus. However, it's not. I think it's hard to say definitively that it was this is what happened, but I think it's possible. Also, the church fathers mentioned Pantera. They go about it in a different way, obviously, and they essentially start to say that Pantera was sort of like a surname of Joseph, and that was mentioned by Epiphanius and John of Damascus. So they kind of try to incorporate it by making it essentially not a problem. But so that kind of indicates to me that there might be something to it. So if I was like, if I would say I would like lean more towards it being true, but I'm not like 100% convinced.
No, that makes sense. Okay, so moving along in our questions about like Jesus and the Talmud and what we know, what can we ascertain of what kind of Jew Jesus was? Do you see connections between John the Baptist, which that would lead to the Mandeans, Jesus and the Essenes? And have you seen, because I've seen some suggestions that Joseph, Jesus' father, was a Pharisee, and that James Hasadik, or James the Just, was a Pharisee. The three Judaisms that were referenced in Josephus was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Does the Talmud place Jesus within any of those, or can you find anything that speaks to what kind of Jew they saw Jesus as?
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to note that the Talmud actually says there were 24 sects of Jews at the time of the Second Temple. So they would definitely go above and beyond what Josephus says, and he was trying to map those movements onto Greek philosophical schools. So he probably shaped those in a certain way for that. So first, I'll say I don't think there's any connection between Jesus and the Essenes. Based off the sources that we have, I know that a lot of people are interested in trying to read the Dead Sea Scrolls and find references to Jesus. I don't think it's impossible, but I don't think you can definitively say that they're referring to Jesus. So I think if you don't have that,
are you talking about Robert Eisman, where he tries to connect the teacher of righteousness and that? Yeah, I don't think you can directly connect in any way. My association would be more in the philosophical vein of the Essene and the Qumran faith, not with people specifically within the Dead Sea community. I would not place Jesus or James as the teacher of righteousness, but it seems like the branch of Judaism, and there is evidence within the church fathers that they considered the Ebionites a branch of Essene. So I would not associate them with any of the writings specifically within the Dead Sea Scrolls, but are they influenced by that branch of Judaism is more my question.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we're kind of on the same page a little bit there with the teacher of righteousness and stuff like that. There's obviously some overlap because if we're looking at John the Baptist, we know that he was a baptizer, immerser, we could say, someone who believed in immersion as like a regular practice of Judaism, and obviously that was a practice of the Essenes. And from what we can tell, Christianity to a certain extent, not in the same way though. It develops
changed,
quite differently. We don't really know a lot about John the Baptist either. I think that the Gospels misrepresent John the Baptist quite significantly, especially if you compare with what Josephus says, which is really the only thing we could do with the material that we have. But we don't know how old the Mandean material is, and it reads significantly like it's older and unique, and also based off earlier texts. So, but it might reflect something from an earlier period, but we don't know. But so I would say that I don't think that John the Baptist was like in the Gospels, you see the issue of like repentance and the kingdom of heaven is coming. If you compare that to Josephus, it's not really what he's saying. So it seems like that there is like the teshuvah, the repentance, seems to be something that John was saying, but it's almost like he's concerned about ritual purity. If you read Josephus kind of closely, so that would be kind of completely different than what the synoptics are saying about John. So there's I think there's some overlap with the Essenes, but they were obviously like a separatist group, from what we understand. Well, let's rephrase. Let's kind of I'll take that back. The Qumran group was a separatist group. It seems like that they lived at that site. There's a lot of debate amongst Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, and it's not something that I'm intimately familiar with, so I don't, kind of careful in what I'm saying here, but it seems like the Qumran group was separatist and kind of separate from mainstream society. So in that sense, John was kind of similar to that, in that he was, associated with the wilderness. But it does seem like Jesus was not separatist. He was, at least from the sources that we have, again, we're going back to that. In the Gospels, he's portrayed as going to towns and villages and even Jerusalem. So, and Jesus goes to the temple in the Gospels, so that would not be something the Essenes would do. If the Gospels are portraying Jesus accurately, of course, with all the caveats. As I said earlier, I think there's something within the Nazarene mundane connection. I'm not sure exactly what that is. If it is some sort of sectarian identity that existed before Jesus, it might have included some of the things that are in Mondaism, which is the idea that the Torah was corrupted in some sense. That's kind of what Epiphanius is saying, that they believed that the Torah was corrupted, but they kept like the observance of some of the mitzvot of the commandments. It's hard to know if that's the case or not, but it seems like there might be something there, but again, I'm not sure. And the Talmud, if we take notzri, as we were saying earlier, to mean Nazarene, maybe it's saying that. Also, the Talmud presents Jesus as a rabbi, so that would make him a Pharisee, kind of member of that community, who essentially commits sins and not adultery, idolatry, worships idols, and is essentially like excommunicated from the circle of rabbis. So they present him as a rabbi, and it might be the case that maybe he was some sort of Pharisee. It's hard to know because of the sources. You read certain things in the Gospels, like the belief in resurrection. You could some of the but then Jesus doesn't really seem to be concerned with ritual purity. But then again, is that Jesus, or is that reflection of like later Pauline Christianity? So it's kind of, I think it's hard to
probably
say.
more Pauline Christianity and later revisionism. Some of those texts that come into the Gospels aren't in the earliest manuscripts. So actually a lot of this, almost all, I don't know if there's any statement within the Gospels regarding ritual purity that is in the earliest manuscripts that's added over time. So I'm not sure the historical Jesus would have been as Pauline in his approach to the rejection of ritual purity, and I don't think that's authentic to what the historical Jesus would have done. So, but yeah. So that's probably the case, that we know the Gospels reflected Pauline Christianity, so that's definitely, there's no question there. I think we don't know what's behind that. So I think that's kind of where we have to end, unfortunately. Or, you can't go any further than that. You can speculate, I think, but I don't think you know. Okay, moving along. So who was Jesus' teacher, and what did he teach Jesus? And does the Talmud give us any indication of how Jesus lived as a Jew, or what his practice of Judaism was like?
Sure. Well, first I'll say the Talmud does not mention John the Baptist by name anywhere. And the teacher of Jesus in the Talmud is Yehoshua ben Prachia. As we said earlier, that's the connection to the earlier Hasmonean period. Yehoshua ben Prachia was a important figure of Judaism at the time, leader of the Sanhedrin. So he was, according to tradition, he's obviously very far back in the transmission. So we don't know much about him. There's a few halachic teachings attributed to him about ritual purity and a few other things. But we have a few ethical statements in Pirkei Avot, which is essentially it's a very poignant message when you compare it with what happens between him and Jesus in the narrative. It's essentially something like, treat. Let me try to look it up. I don't want to misquote it, but it's because the rabbis essentially kind of use Yehoshua as a mechanism to, at least according to some scholarly understanding, to kind of self-criticize their own reaction to Christianity over time. And I think that Yehoshua was chosen for a specific reason to connect him to Jesus. I'll explain that. But here's the teaching that he says. So it says, Yehoshua ben Parachia used to say, appoint for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a companion and judge all men with the scale weighted in his favor. There's like judge all people favorably, basically. And so in the Talmudic narrative, the excommunication of Jesus is essentially due to a misunderstanding between Yehoshua ben Parachia and Jesus. They're coming back from Egypt, and Yehoshua says something like, isn't this in this like hotel that we're staying at, isn't it beautiful? And Jesus misunderstands it to be referring to the innkeeper's wife, who's a woman, obviously. And he says something essentially like, "Oh, her eyes are too, don't look good. How could you say she looks good?" And then Yehoshua says that Jesus has sinned and basically, ostracizes him. And Jesus comes back to repent, and Yehoshua is saying the morning prayers, and he kind of holds his hand like this, like saying, "Wait a second." But Jesus misunderstands it to be like, "I'm not receiving you." And then Yehoshua goes back to Jesus and tries to get him to repent and come back. And Jesus quotes a teaching of Yehoshua ben Parachia, which is basically like, if you've been rebuked by your teacher, you can't come back, essentially. And so scholars understand that story to be, fictitious and not real per se, but reflect more of like a meta commentary on the development of Christianity and the rabbinic response to it, and that they, didn't respond the best way they could. So Yehoshua is, a character there's not a lot of material on him either in the Talmud. And I think he was chosen for two reasons. One, I think there is a subtle reference to John the Baptist. We know that if the rabbis were familiar with Christian materials, which it seems like they were in Syriac, they would know that Jesus had a teacher who was John the Baptist in the Gospels. And John the Baptist is John, the son of Zechariah. In Hebrew, it would be Yohanan ben Zechariah. Right. Yeah. So I think there's a close play on words with Yehoshua, which kind of starts with the same sound, and then Parachia and Zechariah. I think that it was chosen because it kind of has that. It brings that it sounds kind of familiar. The last name, not the last name, but the son of the father's name, and so the second reason why Jesus was associated with Yehoshua is the magic bowls, which I haven't mentioned up to this point, but this is a big, important piece of the puzzle of the Talmud. In the Babylonian period, in broader culture, there was a practice of using these bowls that have incantation texts on the inside, and they were used for magical purposes. And coincidentally, Christians, Jews, and pagans used the name of Yehoshua ben Parachia to kind of, he was used in these they're called gittin, divorce papers that you give in Jewish law, but they were used to like divorce someone from a demon. And it was a sort of magical exorcism kind of thing. And so Yehoshua ben Parachia was associated with that, and also Jesus was associated with that. So they found texts with both of their names in the magic bowls. And so I think that the rabbis were also and this is something that's come out in scholarship too, that they might have been connecting them together because they were both part of this magic both thing tradition, which was a big problem for the rabbis at the time, because this was some obviously prohibited according to Jewish law, and something that they didn't want to condone or let continue. So I think that they were linked together because they were both associated with magic. So that's the general thrust of what the Talmud says about Jesus's teacher. And as I said earlier, they use Yehoshua as sort of a way of thinking broadly about Christianity and Judaism and how they developed and how things could have been different if they approached it differently.
All right. So what does the Talmud claim about what Jesus taught, and how many disciples, and who are his disciples?
Okay, there are one explicit reference to Jesus's teaching in the Talmud, which is a halakhic teaching. It develops throughout the from the Tosefta to the Babylonian Talmud. I'm going to pull it up just because it's a little longer. I don't want to misquote it. The first part is so it has to do with Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, who, as we were just saying earlier, was arrested for heresy. And so he found a teaching of Jesus the Nazarene to be a good teaching. I'm trying to find here the source for it, but the teaching is halakhic in nature. Here it is. Okay. So it occurs in the, let's see, where are we here? Okay. So it occurs in, hold on 1 second here. Okay. Gone to the wrong place. There in the other teaching that is mentioned from Jesus is actually not a quote of Jesus himself, but it is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew. It is sort of a variant quote of the part in Matthew 5 where it says, like, I have come to fulfill the law and not to overthrow it. I forget exactly how Matthew words it.
Not to abolish it.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So there's a quote of that in the Talmud it's a little bit different, but and it refers to the Evangelion, the wicked document, which most scholars understand to be a reference to Evangelion, which is the Greek for the gospel. The other one, the teaching that is referred to by Jesus, is found when it's talking about that episode with Rabbi Eliezer, and he so it's after Jesus, and there's a famous follower of Jesus in the Talmud called Yaakov the Mean, or Yaakov the Heretic, sometimes called Yaakov of Kfar Sechania. And this might be sort of like a generalized version of Jacob, Yaakov, the brother of Jesus, but in like a very sort of artificial way. It doesn't really reveal much about him, but I think that the rabbis would have known that he was a prominent figure. And so anyway, he is the one who interacts with Rabbi Eliezer, but the teaching is so it says that Yaakov said to Eliezer, it is written in your Torah, you shall not bring the payment to a prostitute, or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God, which is from Deuteronomy 23:19. So the question is, what is the halacha? What is the law in this case? I'm just going to my phone here. So it stops ringing. And so the question is, what is the thing that we have to do in this case? Because Jewish law is understanding Torah commandments and how they're practically implemented. So the question is it permitted to make from the payment to a prostitute for services rendered a bathroom for the high priest? So it's like, can you use money that you take from payment from a prostitute to pay for a bathroom for the high priest in the temple? It's a very strange question, but from our perspective, for rabbinic perspective, it's actually not that strange of a question. They were concerned about these kind of minutiae. But anyway, and so the teaching in the name of Jesus is that he refers to Micah 1:7 and says, for the payment to a prostitute, she has gathered them, and to the payment to a prostitute, they shall return. And so the teaching is, since the coins come from a place of filth, let them go to a place of filth and be used to build a bathroom. So essentially, like, because prostitution was seen as kind of like a disgusting thing, you could use the coins that you got from that to pay for a bathroom, which is also, a disgusting thing. It's kind of a strange teaching,
Mm.
and it's been read in a number of different ways. Does it reflect some sort of historical teaching from Jesus, like an agraphon, a saying of Jesus not found in canonical material? What does it reflect? Some sort of teaching of Jewish Christians? Is it some other imagined debate, like the rabbis are thinking of like an imagined debate of how they would respond to Christian debate, a Jewish Christian debate? So there's a lot of different ways to understand it. And essentially, the metaphor of prostitution is found a lot with reference to heresy or minut. And so the rabbis kind of use this as a way to say, like, that there should be social distance between the rabbinic community and the minim, the what's called heretics. And so those are the two teachings of Jesus that we really have in the Talmud. It doesn't mention much. It is clear that there were people teaching in the name of Jesus after his death, and that's who the rabbis were interacting with, as the stories show.
Okay. So Jesus is a sorcerer. Now, I don't subscribe to the view that the miracles or eschatology of the Gospels are authentic, but it became a big part of Christianity. There is evidence of a late addition of these, within the textual tradition of the New Testament, at least. But what do the rabbis make of Jesus doing miracles?
Well, there's no direct stories of Jesus performing miracles in the Talmud. It's very it's implied but not directly stated. As we said earlier, the charge against Jesus is that he was a sorcerer and he practiced magic, and that means healing in the ancient world. The barrier between magic and religion, as we understand it, was much thinner in that time. So things that we would consider magic would have been very prevalent in ancient practice and religion. So it's very much implied that Jesus was a healer, to use a more neutral term, rather than magician or sorcerer. But it's not directly stated. The followers of Jesus are referred to as directly as healing in the name of Jesus, the Nazarene. And so I was going to say something. Let's see, what was the other thing I was going to say? Sorry, lost my thought. So it doesn't say he was a teacher, a healer per se, but it's implied, and that's it's really stemming from a interpretation. Someone who performs supernatural acts, how do they do that? And so Christians would say he was using the power of God. And then Jews would say he was using magic or the powers of demons, things like that. And you see that in the Gospels too. There's a reference to Jesus healing by the power of Satan, and things like that. So it's a matter of interpretation. I tend to think that the stories of Jesus being a healer are probably true in some sense. I don't think the Gospel stories themselves are like word for word historical episodes, but I think it's quite likely he was some sort of healer. That's just from how he was known from everyone. And so that being the case, the association with magic is there. And in the book, I kind of talk about that there might be some sort of rabbinic commentary, more or less, or reaction to the methods of healing that are found in the Gospel of Mark and John, particularly, which are curiously removed by Matthew and Luke, where Jesus uses spit and will rub on people's eyes and things like that. There's which is prohibited directly in the Talmud, and there's the phrases in Mark, like where there's specific Aramaic phrases, might be some sort of form of like incantation phrase that was used. And there are permissible forms of magic in the Talmud and prohibited forms of magic in the Talmud. And that might have to do with the contemporary reality in Babylon of there being the magic bowl. So they had to combat that by providing some forms of magic that were okay, but also saying what was not okay. And so it could be that the case, as you know, and but other people might not know, that the Jewish text is typically built on multi-vocality, meaning different things. It doesn't have to mean one thing; it can mean different things. And in the interpretation of the Torah, for example, there are 4 levels of there's peshat, the literal meaning. There's darash. There's and it goes on and on. So you can unveil the layers of the meaning of the text. And so I think you can do the same thing with the Talmud, and I think they can be doing multiple things at the same time. They could be commenting on the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels, and also dealing with the people who were using magic incorrectly in their own day. So that's kind of how I see the reference to Jesus as a sorcerer as being commentary on the Gospels and how Jesus is presented as doing miracles, and also probably commenting on their own social reality in 6th, 7th century Babylon.
Okay. All right. So moving along, the Talmud, what does it make of Jesus' death? How did he die? Was he crucified?
It does refer to, so the sorcery is the most common, or the most developed, I guess you could say, tradition is found in Tractate Sanhedrin, where the trial of Jesus is mentioned, and so the charge against him is essentially that he committed sorcery. That's the first charge, that he incited people to idolatry, and that he led Israel astray. Those are the 3 charges that are presented in the passage. So the practicing sorcery bit is what we were talking about a second ago. Inciting people to idolatry it's hard to know what the reference is to here. Some people think this is more an attack on like contemporary Christian worship of Jesus that the rabbis saw. It's because it's not clear that the historical Jesus would have done any sort of idolatry that we can know of, and leading the people astray is related to the idolatry piece. So sort of taking people away from Torah. So I would kind of divide that charge, and some scholars say that that the idea of being charged for sorcery might go back to something historical, and so they and the Talmud agrees with the Johannine narrative that says it was on the eve of Passover, and so they think the Instone Brewer is the scholar. I'm kind of looking at here just 'cause there's a few things I want to say that I don't want to forget, but
Okay.
so he would say that the original tradition was, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu for sorcery and enticing Israel. He reads through the text and kind of sees the layering of different components and things like that. So what you have here is probably a tradition about the execution of Jesus that was then rabbinized, kind of put into rabbinic halacha, even though it might have not occurred how the rabbis envisioned executions to have taken place. And there's some sort of you could say veiled references to crucifixion in the passage there. When they talk about hanging, that is understood to be a reference to Roman crucifixion. And there's a teaching.
Let me finish up. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna have to move to a different location, but you can keep talking. Hold on. I'm just gonna mute myself if that's possible.
Okay. So we were saying that the term hanging might refer to be a sort of a veiled reference to crucifixion. And so there's an approach to execution where the understanding by rabbinic legal analysis is that someone who commits certain crimes is stoned to death, and then their body is hanged. And this is based off of a verse in Deuteronomy. So this might be when a text appears in the Talmud, the rabbis are essentially trying to place this back, place this historical memory into a rabbinic framework. In the same passage that we have here from the execution of Jesus, there's also a reference to Jesus being an inciter, a mesite, who is someone who leads people astray from Torah. And also there is the reference to Jesus being close to the government, which is a sort of famous phrase from the Talmud, which has been mostly understood to be sort of a commentary or reaction to the sort of interesting relationship between Pilate and Jesus in the gospel narratives, that where Pilate seems to be very merciful towards Jesus when he really shouldn't be, from any historical understanding of that person. And so the Talmudic narrative is sometimes some scholars try to reconcile it to the accounts in the Gospels, John versus Synoptics, Gospel of Peter. So I think I'm not sure that it's 100% reflecting historical reality. I think it does reflect some kernel. It might be referring to, as we know that in Josephus, the brother of Jesus, Jacob, is sentenced to execution by the Sanhedrin. It's not clear what sort of power the Sanhedrin had in the first century to do executions. But all the Gospels do seem to indicate there was some sort of involvement of them. So maybe this is a reflection of that, the charges that were brought, and being an insider might have been viewed by the Romans as something that would be worthy of, they might want to stamp that out before it got too out of hand. So that's some thoughts about the execution of Jesus as it occurs in the Talmud.
Okay. I mean, him inciting an insurrection, or essentially, I don't know, the claim that he went to Jerusalem to be the king of Jews would be considered an incitement to insurrection, at least within Rome. I'm not sure how that would play within Jewish.
To be clear, the Talmud doesn't refer to insurrection. So okay. It might be implying that, but it doesn't refer to it explicitly.
Okay. All right. I am on a little bit of a time crunch, but I have a couple more questions here real quick, and kind of moving along. So does the Talmud regard Jesus as a failed prophet or false messiah? Were there other messiahs who may have failed in their mission that were noted within the Talmud? And would you agree with the assessment that generally in Jewish history, Jesus is seen as unremarkable and more of a marginal Jew, that he's not in the corpus, in the fullness of the text of the Talmud, it doesn't really address him that much?
The Talmud does not refer to Jesus as a failed Messiah. There are some veiled references, but it's not 100% clear. Prophet, no, I don't think that it does say that. It really just refers to him as a sorcerer. So you can maybe imply that that's a false prophet, but it doesn't explicitly say that. The Talmud actually doesn't really talk about false messiahs that much. It only mentions Bar Kokhba, really. And it says pretty negative things about Bar Kokhba too. So maybe you could draw a comparison there. With regard to overall rabbinic and broader Jewish approach to Jesus, it depends on where you are. In Europe, the approach was to minimize the Talmudic Jesus for obvious reasons. So rabbinic Ashkenazi Jews in Europe were the ones who really promoted the idea that the Jesus in the Talmud is not the Christian Jesus, because they wanted to save lives, and that's a very noble and a good reason to do so, because obviously the atrocities faced by Jewish people at the hands of the church and European powers and things like that, and the Holocaust was not part of that, but it kind of came out of that, obviously, but was obviously terrible. So it makes sense that in a Christian countries and Christian lands, there would be that reaction. However, in Islamic lands, that was not the case, and there was quite a vibrant Jewish polemical engagement with Christianity. There's a number of Jewish works against Christianity, including using the Talmudic material, like I was saying earlier, but also relying on other critiques of Christianity, because the political reality was different and there was no fear of being of losing their lives for that purpose. So I guess it kind of depends on where you are and how you quantify it. Maybe be different. Also in European lands, there was more of an attempt, sort of broadly speaking, to what's the word? Maybe like re-Judaize Jesus, saying like the modern sort of idea that Jesus was a Pharisee, was a Torah observant Jew. That kind of came out of Ashkenazi lands. Sephardic Jews, from my knowledge, and I learned with the Sephardic rabbi, so I was familiar with the Sephardic approach to Judaism. Was much more in line with the Talmud and negative towards Christianity and Jesus as a figure. So it really it comes from that political reality and the culture and things like that. I think also Sephardic Jews were reacting against Islam too, because Islam has a positive view of Jesus in like non-Christian way. So they might have additionally highlighted the Talmud to differentiate themselves from Muslims.
All right. So do you see within the Talmud, though, I guess my question was, does it seem that he was a marginal Jew? Like he wasn't a large figure in the, he didn't play large in the narrative of the Talmud.
Oh, well, okay. So I guess that's also kind of a question of perspective, because it kind of depends. One, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the legal code of the Mishnah and supplemental material discussion based off of it. So the Talmud is mostly concerned with law and how to practice the commandments of the Bible, with biblical exegesis attached on top of it, and then miscellaneous other material, stories, dreams, recipes, medical advice, things like that. I think that the stories about Jesus appear appropriately in the Talmud where you would expect them to occur. They occur in discussions about like trial laws, how to conduct trials and executions, things like that. Discussions of idolatry, discussions of like the prohibition of magic. So I think they occur contextually in appropriate places. I think it's hard to say that they occur less or more than they should occur. People tend to say that it's infrequent, and I mean, like if you were to compare the number of words spoken about Jesus, of course that's the case. But there's more about Jesus than some other rabbinic figures. So I think it's a question of perspective. I think they occur contextually in appropriate places, and the Talmud has what you would expect it to say about Christianity in the Zoroastrian society where Christianity was one of the other religions that were there.
Okay. Speaking of Christianity, and we're kind of getting to the end of my questions here. I mean, how does the Talmud refer to Christians? What is this in relation to the minim, the heretics?
Yeah. Well, we talked about Nazarene already, so people can hear that earlier. The minim is a pretty controversial issue. There's not really a lot of consensus about what they are. Some people think they're Jewish Christians. Some people think they're Samaritans, Gnostics, pagans. People, sometimes it's more framed from like a social perspective. People who are like maybe like non-conformists, people who don't follow rabbinic laws entirely. I tend to think of it as a shifting category. The rabbinic mind is very prone to categorization. The rabbis are really concerned about categorizing people into men and women, and priests and non-priests, and Jews and Gentiles, and Samaritans and converts and minors, and so there's a lot of categories in the Talmud. That's something that's very frequent. I think that category of minim or mean changes throughout time. I think in the earlier period, it's probably more likely that it does refer to Jewish Christians, or maybe other surviving sects movements after the temple that didn't agree with the rabbis. I think in later periods, excuse me, I think it's more likely that in the Babylonian period, it refers to people who were using the magic bowls and using the name of Jesus in magic that was not permitted by rabbinic authority, because there's questionable evidence whether Jewish Christians still existed in the 6th and 7th centuries, and there wouldn't the minim appear to be connected to the Jewish community in some way, so they would not be referring to regular Christians, non-Jewish Christians. Some have presented an interesting case that during Sasanian persecution of Christians, which did occur occasionally, that some Christians tried to Judaize and were praying in synagogues and things like that. I'm not 100% sure about that argument, but it's very interesting. But I think that it's referring to users of magic bowls in the later texts. So I think the Jewish, the rabbinic approach to Christianity is mixed, and it depends on what era you're in and what's being said. There in the earlier material, Tosefta, Jerusalem Talmud, there are plenty of stories of people healing in the name of Jesus, and I think those are pretty obvious that those are referring to Jewish Christians of some kind. But as I said, I think throughout time it shifts.
Okay. There is some evidence that the Ebionites existed up to the 8th century in Muslim lands, and that their belief system may have been formulative in the Muslim conception of
that's why I said questionable, because it's kind of like some people present that, but some don't agree. So
yeah, I mean, that's just something to consider there. Last question about Jesus in the Talmud, before my final question is the general sense of the rabbis' view of Jesus in the Talmud positive, negative, or ambivalent?
I think you could say, I think it's pretty simple to say that it was negative. I mean, he's called a bastard, magician, sorcerer, idolater, a heretic. So I think that's negative. But there is a positive side. There is a self-reflective side that we were mentioning earlier, where they don't place all the blame on Jesus. Like we said, with the story of Yehoshua ben Parachia, there was a level of reflection where the rabbis as a community realized that mistakes were made along the way, and it wasn't only the Christian community that separated. So they had some part to play in that. But I would say overall negative.
Yeah, that was my understanding. Okay, so outside of the Talmud, are you familiar with the polemical work Talmud Yeshu? Its views of Jesus, but kind of more specifically in the text, it talks about a conflict between Shimon Kepha, who we know as Peter, and Simon Magus, who within the Pseudo-Clementine literature is also listed as in conflict with Shimon Kepha or Peter. And most people see Simon Magus as Paul, or like some kind of derogative name towards him. Are you familiar with that, or have you read up on that at all?
I'm less familiar with Tilda Yeshu. I know that there's several different versions of it. Most people assume that it's a medieval text that postdates the Talmud. There's a few people who believe it's earlier. And it's I view it as post-Talmudic and sort of a narrativization of the Talmudic material, because the Talmud doesn't present like one narrative. It's sprinkled throughout different texts in the different places. So I view the Toldo Yeshu as kind of a codification of the material into like one narrative. But there are different versions of it. And some of them place Jesus under Pilate, some in the Hasmonean era. I know that the traditions about Peter, there's a tradition that he was like a sort of double agent, someone sent by the rabbis to push Christianity away from Judaism. And there's even traditions that he wrote some of the prayers in the weekly Sabbath liturgy. There was a prayer called Nishmat Chai, which is said in synagogues every Shabbat morning. Obviously, I think those traditions are not true, but it could reflect that attitude of Christianity coming out of Judaism. there's a connection there from the beginning that was broken over time. Also, there's probably in the same way that Christians played with Jewish characters, like Gamaliel is in Acts. There was probably an attempt to, appropriate, to use a modern word, some of the Christian characters into Judaism. So that's kind of how I would see Tolda Yeshu, but I'm less familiar with it than the Talmud.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to go over Jesus and the Talmud with me and your work on this. Really informative. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, thank you
Thank you
for
for having
taking
me.
your time. Any
Yeah,
last words that you want to give before we sign off here?
You can check out I'm on Facebook and Twitter and everything. My website is Dr. A. Jordan, DRA.Jordan.com. Some of the material I talked about today is going to be the book that I have out now is called Jesus, the Nazarene, the Talmud, and the Founder of Christianity. It's a general audience book, so it's an easy read. It's it's not meant to be for the specialist. It's meant to be for someone who has no knowledge of the Talmud. Easy to approach. I'm working on an academic version of the book, which goes into much more detail. So you can follow me for updates on that. I hope to publish that within a year. I'm more than halfway done with that, and it'll have some of the things that I said today are not necessarily in the book, but will be in the academic book that I'm publishing later.
All right, excellent. All right, well, thank you, and I'll post this next Monday, and look forward to conversations in the future.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, have a good one.